And then it got bad over the course of a couple of years. It got really bad, and everybody was like, how did this happen? The PMs should have known everything about tech and prioritized tech debt. And I just think that's unrealistic in a different way. PMs, even like me as a technical background PM when I was a PM, I didn't go deep on the technical part. I don't know what parts of the code base are hard to use or cause a lot of bugs or problems. That the engineers handle that. And since they have the context, I want them prioritizing within that domain of like engineering-led things, which ones are more important to work on or less. And then at the table, negotiating what proportion of work or like which items we're going to focus on. And if they're not at the table, it's going to happen. Sorry, everybody, that you didn't like the outcome there, but you have to advocate for yourselves there.
Today, I'm talking to Casey Watts. Casey was an engineering manager at Heroku and a product manager at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration. Most recently, he worked as the chief of staff to the CTO at Datavant, and he's been helping teams become more happy and effective for a number of years. You can check out his work over at happyandeffective.com. This session, we talked about technical trade-offs, engineering leadership's role in building culture, and how PMs and engineering can work together to manage tech debt. Hope you enjoy. But yeah, so excited to get started. I just wanted to start by talking about one blog post that I read from you recently, which was about how PMs can come from different sorts of backgrounds. You talked about how, the engineers or the PMs who come from like an engineering background, they're going to have like a strong technical background, right? PMs who come from a business background, they're going to be focused more on business outcomes. And then PMs that come from like some other place are going to be a bit more creative or like have more industry experience. And just like how that relates to how they perform the function. And like obviously personally, like I have a bit more of a technical background. I think you do as well. So kind of lend more into like the technical side of things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a better PM.
Yeah. So for an example of when I was a PM for the government, and I had recently been an engineering manager before that, I wasn't really doing any engineering related stuff at all. I was like, this is kind of weird. I was managing designers, engineers, and product managers, all three, because I just had those backgrounds, but I really didn't know what the engineers were doing. I didn't know their tech stack. I didn't get deep into it, and I tried not to. So even though I had that technical background, I think what that really got me was I respected the technical points of view on the team a lot, deeply, but I didn't know what was going on, and that was good. I wasn't trying to. I was really, really focused on the other things. But I made sure that they had a seat at the table even when they didn't want one. And that's probably the biggest, most surprising thing that we might talk about today, is that a lot of engineers don't seem to want to be involved in planning and strategy work, or they don't feel empowered to, even if they do. And that's the crux of what I think that more teams need in tech lately.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think just to get into that a little bit more, I've seen kind of two types of engineers broadly. One is like engineers who are super focused on improving their technical skills, or like really love like kind of like the pure aspects of programming, right? Like that's what they really enjoy. And then there's engineers who want to build stuff for people. Like they're more focused on the product side, and obviously doing engineering work, but they're interested in the outcome of their work. I find usually like the more product focused engineers will want a bit more of a seat at the table. They will want to be involved. They want to understand what they're doing. But have you seen that like kind of play out?
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty useful dichotomy. It's like how product minded or tech minded is somebody. I like to make sure that there's at least one engineer at the seat, having a seat at the table in any team. So if you don't have any product-minded engineers at all, I think that's a problem for a lot of tech teams, because they're not going to make good technical decisions. They're going to end up with a lot more tech debt. It's going to accrue over time more because they're not at the table. But I don't think it's important for every engineer to be at the table. I think it's great if you have a mix of folks who can represent the team in the strategy meetings and folks that just kind of do what they're told and they're happy with that and that's all they wanted to do. It's a good mix for a team.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. On the side of like, ensuring that they at least one engineer, someone has a seat at the table, and you can like avoid some tech debt that way, or maybe avoid some poor decision making. Have you seen examples of like when that's not the case?
Oh, a lot of teams. I think most teams I've worked with, no engineers at the table, unless I'm the one barging the door down or getting people to do it. So I don't know, in my government job, just as an example, the engineers by default did not want to do any strategy and planning on all the 5 teams that were around. And they didn't want to prioritize the tech debt, the backlog of tech debt, of the things that the engineers would prioritize. I call that the engineering-led backlog. They didn't have one. They didn't want one. That's not their skill set. That wasn't their interest. Nobody on that team, the 20 people that I'm thinking of, none of them were interested in that. And then it got bad over the course of a couple of years. It got really bad, and everybody was like, how did this happen? the PMs should have known everything about tech and prioritized tech debt. And I just think that's unrealistic in a different way. PMs, even like me as a technical background PM when I was a PM, I didn't go deep on the technical part. I don't know what parts of the code base are hard to use or cause a lot of bugs or problems. That the engineers handle that. And since they have the context, I want them prioritizing within that domain of like engineering-led things, which ones are more important to work on or less. And then at the table, negotiating what proportion of work or like which items we're going to focus on. And if they're not at the table, it's going to happen. Sorry, everybody, that you didn't like the outcome there, but you have to advocate for yourselves there. But I don't blame the engineers. I blame the culture mostly. The culture didn't encourage engineers to go to the table.
Right. What does it look like when like it goes bad, I guess? Like, what is the impact of that? Just in case anyone hasn't experienced that before. So no one works on tech debt for 2 or 3 years.
And then anytime you get a request, it sounds simple, like, oh, we need to, I don't know, another type of user is getting onboarded. We need to have another workflow for them. And then we add it. We're like, oh my God. The business side will say, oh, it's easy. You've done it before. So now it'll probably just take you like, I don't know, a week. Oh, you say 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Oh, that's fine. Okay, well, I don't know why you're so slow. And then it takes 4 months because it's so much tech debt and it's painful for the team working on it. They thought they'd be done in 1 week. They wanted to be done. I mean, even if they knew they wouldn't get done in a week, that's what they're told, and they want to meet those expectations, and it sounds reasonable if the healthy code base were healthy, but it's not healthy lately. And everybody's upset, business and product and engineering, and it was avoidable, but that needs engineering technical leadership to advocate for the steps that it takes to make it avoidable.
Yeah, and then on like the product side, so let's say we have a product manager who isn't from a technical background, so they maybe don't fully understand like, why would you prioritize tech debt other than like maybe they've been told they should at some point? How do you think about those types of product managers and how like they can kind of help engineers get a seat at the table or help ensure that these things don't happen?
So I actually think it's not their responsibility to get this cultural environment set up for that. I think it's engineering leadership's position. So an engineering manager or director or somebody like that to tell their employees and to tell product like, we need to be at the table. It's important for reasons. And if they don't understand why, that's okay. I mean, not to steamroll them and do it anyway, but say like, you don't need to understand the technical parts, but we need to be involved. We are advocating for ourselves here. I don't like this mindset that a lot of companies have that the product leads everything. Product leads every single thing, all the design-led things, all the engineering-led things, all the product-led things. They lead them all. Even that's not a very healthy mindset. I think a product manager could do things to make their team more amenable to it, but if engineering leadership's not pushing for it, it doesn't go as well. Like, it's hard to pull engineering into it if you're not responsible for them, if you're not their leadership.
Right. Yeah. It makes sense that there needs to be kind of like set up the culture where engineering has some responsibility, accountability, or ownership for these types of things, right?
Yeah. And we can assume that happens. If that happened already and engineering leadership's pushing for it, then what can a PM do to make it more welcoming and encourage people to come? That's a different question. And I think that's also valuable and useful to talk about. I think just realizing you don't know everything about the technical side and saying that out loud once in a while grounds yourself to remind yourself that it's true. You know it's true. I know. I haven't worked with any non-technical PMs who are oblivious. They all feel kind of self-conscious really overall, but they don't need to be experts in that. And even a technical one like kind of needs to drop some of that expertise. It's not such a liability not to have the technical background as long as you can include those folks in the decision-making process very early and often and listen to them and respect their points of view.
In terms of like, let's talk about that, like PMs involving. So we have like the engineering buy-in, engineering leadership buy-in to, engineering teams should be involved. They should be accountable. And then you have a PM. What can the PM do to make sure that like they're doing the best they can to ensure their engineering counterpart, like let's say their EM, has the space and the ability to do that?
One thing that I've seen work sometimes is the PM can, if they're the meeting scheduler for the team, which is often a hat that the PM wears, to schedule a meeting to go over the engineering-led backlog of tasks. And if there is none yet, don't just blindside people and do it anyway, but talk about it, make it happen, get it to happen, and then talk through it. And by making space for them to talk about it, that is a really, really powerful lever that the meeting assigner or person has. So like making space is really powerful.
Yeah, and then one challenging thing that I've seen for PMs is when we want to prioritize tech debt or like we're in alignment with the engineering manager, like we should work through this engineering backlog. It can be difficult for PM to defend that decision sometimes to their leadership or to other people in management who really don't understand anything
Yeah.
that like this, and so they're saying like, why are you spending 30% of your time this quarter on this thing instead of moving forward?
Well, who's defending that in this example you're thinking of?
Who is defending? Oh, the
Yeah,
PM.
the PM has to defend
The
that
PM
choice.
gets
It's not their choice. In the healthiest structure that I'd like the engineering org to have, it's not the PM's choice to have, but to give permission for 30% of the team's time back to engineering. I think that engineering should be giving permission for 70% of the time to be done by product. That's healthier. Or really, it's a balance. It's everybody talking together. But as long as there's this assumption, which is pervasive all over lots of companies in tech, that the PM owns the team's time and decides how to allocate it, it's like that's like a fatal flaw. It just biases you toward 100% feature work, which you know very well causes problems.
Yes. Right. And I guess there isn't probably like an ideal like, oh, it's 50-50, 60-40 split. It probably is just contextual on like where we are.
Yeah, it's contextual. I think it does have trends over time. So like a new app, Greenfield, just happened the past couple months, is mostly new feature work. But then as time goes on, like if it's a very old 5 or 10-year-old app, it's probably 50% engineering-led things, and that's healthy. And it needs that 50%, whatever those hours, engineering hours are, to stay healthy and keep the customers happy with the current feature set or whatever, the requirements from the changing environment, like, or, I don't know, SOC requirements, that kind of thing. Like, and engineering can lead those without product, a lot of those.
Yeah, and I imagine that also is kind of different types of PMs as well. Like, do you want to work in an environment where you're starting, 90% feature work, like you're doing everything from the kind of 0 to 1, or are you working more in an environment where you're maintaining and like adding some things, but mostly it's about keeping, current customers satisfied or keeping like things going?
And I think that both are satisfying with the right mindset. Like if you can help current customers be satisfied and you talk to them and they have 100 pain points and you can solve some of them, they will love you, and that's so satisfying to help them be satisfied with the app. But if it's new and you're making new stuff and people love that, that's also satisfying. But even if the lights are about to go off because something's going wrong and you stop that, that's satisfying too with the right mindset.
Yeah, I think there is kind of a bias, or at least at places I've worked, a bias towards the feature work. It's like has more glory associated with it almost. Do you know what I mean?
It is. And that's cultural for a lot of the companies too. And I think part of it comes from a young company that's a startup environment growing, and then it needs to spend more time on engineering-led priorities and maintenance, things like that. But they don't make the switch. So it's still assumed 100% feature work for everybody, way well into when it should be getting 20, 30, 40, 50%. And then everybody like sneaks it in because you have to. It's what the company needs, but the company's culture doesn't shift to allowing space for that.
Yeah. So let's say someone like listens to this and then they kind of identify that they're in an org that's not in this place, right? That engineering doesn't have their own backlog and like we're not prioritizing those items. What can a product manager do to kind of help with this? Obviously not they're solely accountable for this change, like cultural change, but how can they kind of help with this type of problem?
I think you can do it in a small scale on the team that you're working on or the teams you work close to, or a larger scale. And I think both are valuable and interesting, and I hope people will try both. You can get the team to work better by asking the tech lead or engineering manager involved to take more responsibility. Like, please, I need your help. Can you help me out and do what Casey thinks is your job in the first place? But can you do this kind of stuff and prioritize all this? But then on the larger scale, if you can talk to the engineering managers, the leadership level, the leadership team, and product leadership team, and tell them that there's this balance problem, maybe send them some blog posts and YouTube videos from conferences. There's a whole lot about this kind of phenomenon out there, and get that to be a discussion on the leadership team. That can shift the messaging they're telling to all the EMs across the company.
I guess trying to shift that culture can be somewhat challenging.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I know you have some experience across a couple of companies where you've tried to build that kind of culture. I guess any tips on that, like things you've done in the past that worked really well, like at one or two?
So I guess I can plug, I did a talk at RailsConf last year about culture smithing, which is literally about this. Like, how do you nudge culture on the small scale and the large scale? So I've got, I think, 30 or 40 tips in that talk if anyone wants to check that out. But I guess a highlight or two, it's easier to do change on a small scale. So if you get your team to do it as an example, that's really helpful. And then, but then the missing step that people don't always do is you might have a great example in your team, but you don't tell the story. You don't go out to the town hall or demo day or whatever and tell people, and not just once. Once is not enough for any storytelling to stick and to be part of the culture of the corpus of stories that a company has. You have to tell it like 3 to 10 times all over, tell it to every person who will ever listen. Yeah, we switched to this thing, and then look at this awesome outcome that's very obvious and very good, and we love it, and everybody's happy. You have to tell that over and over and over and over and over, and then culture change might happen outside of that small team. But if there's no example of a small team doing it, you might not be ready to spread it wider yet. I think it's good to do an experiment on a team to test it out. But then the spreading it is often just not done at companies. I don't think it's valued work. So even if you're someone and you know that's what the company needs and you want to do it and you spend your time, people might say, why are you doing this? That's disappointing. But in some cultures, it's celebrated to share best practices and to encourage the culture of the company to do better. And there's like 5 or 10% of your time you're expected to do it implicitly. It might be explicit, but often it's implicit. Like, yeah, of course you should be helping other teams. And that's a healthier culture that's good, more likely to accept this kind of change.
Yeah, I can relate to this one. I feel like on the teams that I work in, I try to advocate for a lot of the same ideas, but I've put zero time or effort into trying to share them.
I didn't get anyone to share it, not like as widely and publicly as I wanted. Not these particular things. I didn't get anyone to share it. No one felt like they had the bandwidth. If they did, they would be dinged or penalized by the leadership, whoever. Somebody wouldn't like that they were doing it. That's a shame. So now we're all reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, and especially when you have change in like the team leadership, like an EM changes or a PM changes, you kind of reset a lot of that stuff, right?
So if you have one little bubble that's doing it this way that we talked about that we like, and then the EM changes, you got to maybe start over with the EM, or like maybe halfway start over because the team members still know it, but they might not align to it. But if you have it as a more pervasive, widespread culture across many teams, then now there's this like ambient pressure on this new EM to also prioritize their own tech backlog.
Yeah, I think I'm going to take away from this. Maybe I should do a little bit more in this area because it's not something that I've spent any time on.
Yeah, if you can get away with it, you should. And if your manager or whatever leadership you're talking to the most isn't encouraging you to do it, they should encourage you and everyone else to do it too. On a meta level, that's even more powerful. But if you just start doing it and set a good example, that's a great step forward.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. I did also want to talk a little bit about technical trade-offs. So switching gears a little bit, mostly because that I want to have a little bit of a free-flowing conversation, but I also do want to touch on this topic.
Yeah.
So what like, I guess, what do you think about when someone says technical trade-offs? Like, what does that even really mean? It's something that I've had people ask me questions a lot about. How do you make good decisions?
Yeah.
But yeah.
So depending on the context, this either means why are we letting engineering do any of their stuff that they say they need to do instead of doing feature work? Or it's engineering involved in the conversation and they're saying like we should use Redis or we should just do it in SQL and like those kind of technical trade-offs. And they're really considering many options and why we want to pick one over the other. That might be biased against like the product options, that headspace, which is why we really need both product and engineering in the same room, and design. That's a different story. Yeah, but we need both perspectives in the rooms so that the trade-offs that we're considering are wider, zoomed out, more holistic, and not just let engineering do stuff or not, or between technical decisions. Those are useful, I guess, but this higher level strategy is way more powerful and gets people aligned and more motivated, and we're gonna have a better outcome and get it done faster and better and like good, all the things.
Yeah. So I guess like what should it look like? Obviously we talked about the PM doesn't necessarily have to be responsible for like low level technical decisions. They don't even necessarily know what's going on. It's not their responsibility. But then there is some product involvement when it comes to technical trade-offs. Like
I do workshop with some teams. I don't think we got to do it together, but I come up with like all the different options that we're considering, which might be technical and product focused, or maybe two separate moments, or maybe the same moment, depending on whatever. Anyway, we have a whole bunch of options. Those are rows in my spreadsheet. And then before we decide what we're going to do, we come up with what are the criteria we're using to decide. And those are a bunch of columns. So like we get new users from this, or we make existing users much happier. And then we can rate those 1 to 5 for each option. And some of those columns are owned by engineering, like how feasible is it technically? What's the maintenance overhead we're going to have forever once we install this and set this new thing up, or whatever the team decides the decision-making criteria are. And that varies by team, by context. Those are always different. Like what's the most relevant? And then if we go through and like put numbers and all those, it's not like a magic 8-ball and just tells you what to do, but by having it structured in a way that says we value this, we've agreed, and here's how that applies to everything, and we value this. So it's like product things, engineering things, all mixed together. Then engineering is really on the table. It's on the board. You can point to it. They give us this input, that one that's the best for the users. Oh, it's so hard. It was a 1 out of 5. Like, oh, that's a red flag.
Right. I'm trying to think of like an example I have here is, latency it is a common thing that kind of comes up for technical trade-offs. So if there's like a ton of latency in the UI or even just like some background function that occurs where someone's waiting for something, like a lot of the time it's a bad user experience. So we want to solve for that, right? So I'm just kind of imagining your setup here. You'd have like some column which is in relation to the user experience, and then some column that's in relation to like the feasibility, like can we actually reduce the latency, or like how much do we have to kind of pay and continue to pay to reduce the latency? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And if we're considering it against a whole bunch of other features, there's probably other columns. And those are the most important two for this one. I think you're right. But for others, and we're considering all across the board, a new feature, this new customers, all the other columns. I don't want too many columns either. So often if we have 15 potential columns, I'll buckle them down to 6 and we'll group a whole bunch of things so that it's only the amount that we can all keep in our heads. That's the useful amount. If it's 15 columns, that's chaos in a different way. That's a different problem.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, the score doesn't really dictate, like it doesn't override thinking, I guess, in a way, right? Like,
and if the scores are wrong, if it is something is not a great idea and everyone agrees anyway, and it has a really low score, you gotta think, well, what are we missing? What do we not include here? And you'll maybe find another column or include an idea in a column that changes all the numbers by folding it in.
And then I guess once you have that decision, we talked about like product management not necessarily defending these decisions, right? Maybe like there's some engineering involvement there. So like, how does that work? So like we have a decision, we're going to move forward with this thing, and maybe there's pushback on the decision from leadership.
I think the team leads the trio. If you're lucky enough to have a product engineering and design trio, then that trio can defend these decisions together. And hopefully they're all aligned by the end of this process. And usually once we pull a spreadsheet out, we end up getting aligned every time I've done it, at least. And we say, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. You'd want that stakeholder from across the company. But you see, there's all these other factors. And I don't always pull out the spreadsheet. Depends on who they are. But I can point to them very quickly because we've done that kind of thought process.
Mm-hmm. And then you did mention the designer in there. So I just want to touch on that. Like so far, we've been very focused on product and engineering. So how do you see design like being involved in these types of conversations?
Yeah, I want design on every team, even if it's a minimal UI, even if it's like an API endpoint. We've had designers who, like at Heroku, the API was a huge touch point. A lot of our users were technical, and the API was totally like a user visible thing because of that. That's the kind of users we had there. And so we had designers involved there too about the user experience, and they would research and talk to people. At some companies, product managers do research and interview and talk to the users a lot on their own, but I really like it when that's a specialized role. So when I was a PM, I was so relieved to have a really good user researcher on my side, and then the government job I keep talking about. And she could do all the research. I would have questions, I would help interpret the data, and I would go to some of them to get a vibe, but I didn't have to do it all. She was the expert, thank goodness. And in meetings, often as a PM, I would advocate for business needs, like, this will increase the number of cases that we process, da-da-da-da-da. But then she could advocate for the users, which is a different audience, the business needs versus the user needs. And that we kind of balanced out the discussion. And another benefit of the trio is there's a tiebreaker built in. So if design and engineering wanted something, okay, you all win. Like majority, like I might be missing something here.
Yeah, this goes back to what you were mentioning earlier about like kind of product in some cultures owning almost everything versus having this idea of a trio where you can kind of balance decisions. I do like the idea of like friction in a team that is by design. So if you have a designer, their job is to represent the user, and you have product and their job is to represent the business outcome, some friction there is going to happen. Like that's a natural consequence, but it's good, right? Because you have both sides represented.
And it doesn't have to be stressful. On a healthy team, it's not stressful. You're just advocating for different points of view, and you respect each other, and you respect who you're representing. And but it really helps to have the different perspectives, someone to take each perspective. So if I didn't have a designer and I had to have a strategy meeting, I might even ask an engineer, can you imagine you're the user and you're advocating for them right now? It doesn't go as well, but someone to like have that headspace for this purpose of this discussion is helpful, because you can't have many perspectives at the same time. Switching is hard, and we're not good at it.
Yeah. And even if you like, I guess, are capable of having more than one perspective, you can't really represent them. Like other stakeholders won't see that. So if, they're going to think you're flip-flopping or something like that rather than like you being.
Oh yeah. Sometimes I've had meetings where like, all right, I'm taking the hat off, this hat. I'm going to say the opposite, da, 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 da. And like the hat motion I do with my arms on a video call helps a little bit, but it's still, I look kind of wild. They're like, really? I'd rather have a dedicated person and that it doesn't have any kind of churn or nothing suspicious, nothing looks weird.
Right. Yeah, for sure. You mentioned at Heroku, you all were working on, like some API products. Obviously, Heroku is like a very technical product in and of itself. The users are technical, but for the types of PMs that you worked with there, like generally speaking, I would imagine they were more technical PMs. Like they understood what APIs were, they understood how they work, that sort of thing. Is that a true assumption or not really?
Some of them, but some of them didn't. And like one I'm thinking of was a lot better at the business relationships. So I worked on the marketplace, which they called ecosystem, which is like all the third-party vendors you could plug into your Heroku app very easily. They were in that. So at least one of the PMs was really good at business relationships with these third-party vendors, and they were not technical. And so then that caused different problems on the team. They also didn't always respect the technical decisions, which is a common pitfall for PMs. But they were good at the other part, and that's something that this team did need.
Right. Yeah. So the role of the PM isn't to like, even if you want to be a little bit technical, to use those technical skills to try to solution for engineering. Like, hey, you should use this programming language.
Yeah,
You should use this. You should use Redis or this other thing.
No.
I guess why is it useful for a PM to have some technical knowledge?
Sometimes it helps understand what engineering is advocating for and asking for, so you're following what they're saying and you don't feel disoriented and out of the loop. But more than that, I think it's really just respecting the perspective of engineering. If a PM is not technical at all, but totally respects what engineering is saying, and not over the top, like saying that every meeting, oh, I respect you so much, but you just do and they know it and it's going smoothly. I think that PM could make great technical decisions just by leaning on the expertise of their colleague who is such a specialist in that engineering in general.
Yeah, I have a similar perspective, which is like the values mostly around communication. At least that's what I think. So not so much that like the PM is gonna, again, make those types of decisions, or they're gonna spend any time programming, but they understand.
Oh, actually, I have a funny story. I have a funny story about this kind of thing. When I was a PM in the government and I was a recent engineer, I don't know what it was, something like URL parameters is something I was very familiar with as a front-end engineer. And I told the team like 5 times, like, I don't know what's best. Y'all know, you all pick what you want, but just like URL parameters, if I were engineering this as an engineer, and they knew I was an engineer, they respected me as an engineer too, I would be looking at URL parameters for this because I think it's made for this idea. But y'all are in charge. I don't care if you do it or not. You can pick a different way. There's ways I know I haven't thought of. Y'all are great. You got this. And then 5 weeks later, I mentioned it a couple of times and they never seemed to have looked into it at all. And then the guy looked at it and he was like, this is the best. This is just what we need. Wow, we should have listened to you sooner. But I didn't care. I wasn't upset at all. Because I was fully delegating it to them. I was just bringing up an offhand idea I had. Part of me was tempted to, if I were engineering minded, to go in and like do a spike for an hour and show them what I mean. And that might have been good to get that outcome, but I didn't want to undermine the team's autonomy way, way more. That whatever that implementation was mattered way less than them owning that whole process. I didn't really think about that at all. I didn't consider it. I didn't dare. I wouldn't. But some people have asked, like, why didn't you just show them instead of telling them? Because I didn't want to. Because they're engineering and I was being product and I was trying to keep that hat on.
That's somewhat impressive to me, to be honest. In that, like, I feel like there's an element of pride as well, where you're like, hey, I have an opportunity to maybe show off a little bit, maybe be like, hey, like, I'm good at this too.
Yeah. I feel like luckily they already respected me plenty, so I didn't feel like I had to prove myself to any of the engineers. And some that didn't right away, I would do like a pairing session with them where I was mostly useless because I don't know the stack or the text, and I wasn't planning to get to know it well, but I would just like sit with them and ask, oh, should we refactor that out? Oh, it makes sense. We wouldn't do it right now. Like I would just kind of like shadow, but kind of like pair programming. And that helped me get a lot of rapport with the engineers. And I think that's something I would recommend to a new PM who isn't comfortable technically yet, is to pair with an engineer and like ask a lot of questions or suggest things. And whatever they say, go with what they say, because that's not your role. But why don't we do this thing? Oh, okay, that makes sense. And that builds rapport. One-on-one time builds rapport, and asking questions about the code base shows you're interested and respect them, and that can really strengthen those relationships.
Yeah, I can imagine that's like a little bit of an intimidating situation for the PM in that like they're not in their comfort zone at all. So what kind of mindset should the PM be in like when they're doing something like that? Like what is their goal?
I think being curious about the code base and why it is the way it is. Also, some engineers aren't as good at zooming out and telling you the full perspective, all the different modules that exist and why, when they were made, or like the history, the backstory, and the zoomed out view. So if there's any engineer that like draws diagrams on the team, they might be a good one to talk to and get that high level view. I don't really care how any particular function works that low level as a PM. I never got that deep. And when I did, it was like for a bug, and I was like, yeah, you can show me. Yeah, I'll look at it, whatever. But I don't need to know the whole system. But I need to know the zoomed out version a little bit. So going in with curiosity and I guess humility. But I think that's the easy part. If you're not technical, you're going to be humble and have humility about the whole thing. But being curious, and I hope the engineers like that you're being curious.
Yeah, for sure. I think, building that rapport is, even with like individual engineers, not, just your EM, is really important because that's the team that does the delivery, right? Like,
Yeah. Every engineer in the team, all of them. If a PM hasn't had one-on-ones with every member of the team within the first month, make it a priority. Get it done by the second month.
Yeah, I have maybe a poor analogy here. I wonder if you agree with it. Which is like, if you're working with like surgeons, it's important for you to understand like the process of surgery at the very least. Like what are they doing if you want to be involved in that? And if you don't really understand like anything that's going on, let's say like you're a hospital administrator, you can't influence it. You can't.
Yeah.
And to some degree, like it's hard to win respect.
And there's a deeper level of respect for surgery too. Like, oh, I don't know how you do what you do. I could never do that. That's not the kind of respect I'm thinking. But like, I've looked into it. There is a lot going on here. I thought it was so impressive. This thing that they have to do, you all do that, and you have to think about the other thing. And I know a little bit about what you do, and I'm impressed. Is way, way deeper than I could never. I kind of hate that as a compliment. It's not really a compliment to me. I could never do what you're doing, Casey. I'm like, that's about your self-confidence, not about your relationship with me here.
I actually haven't heard. I mean, maybe it's because I'm in product. Like, I can't do what you do. So maybe I should spend more time on the engineering side.
Oh yeah. People don't say that about product as much. People think they can do product, but a lot of people don't think they could ever program. They coding. As soon as you have a command line blinking or a text editor, people are just like a deer in headlights. They have no idea what to do. They're very intimidated, and they don't even know how they would learn it.
Yeah, I guess to kind of like to wrap up on that topic, you mentioned a lot of people think they can do product. Do you think that like there is a similar idea of like, oh, actually these are the things that make a kind of a good product manager? Or do you think kind of anyone can just kind of find their way, if they've done something similar, like they were a business analyst at some point?
I think most people I've worked with, maybe 80%, say that they've been told to do dumb things. And every time I say that, people laugh and giggle and nod. And yep, I've been told to do really dumb things at work before. And for engineers, at least, in that environment and people working on the software development team, they think they could make better decisions than whoever is making them, not knowing how hard it is to get all the perspectives into your head at the same time and to balance everything and making trade-offs. But I think the really hard part about becoming an effective PM is balancing all the perspectives and making the team set up for success more than you and your individual skills and ability to have lots of thoughts in your head at once from many points of view. Like that's helpful, but getting the team set up for success is more important. And a lot of people don't see it as the PM's role as facilitating that process. They see it as the PM as the decision-making person. And if only I were doing it, a smart person, then I could make really good decisions. And I think that's short-sighted and unfortunate. But also maybe what people expect PMs to do at a lot of companies. So it's not even wrong. It's just to be effective, you have to do it this other way that nobody seems to think of right away.
Yeah. That makes sense. Cool. And then, sorry, there's one last thing I wanted to chat with you about, which is just on the idea of kind of like empowered teams or delegation. Mostly like, let's say top down. So you have like a leadership team and I think ideally from what I've read, from what you've written, you think that the teams below should kind of be delegated to or empowered to make decisions on their work. How does that look like when it's working well?
Yeah, so this is kind of related to like the vision and mission and strategy from a high level, which I haven't seen done particularly well at any company I've worked with. It happens better at lower levels, but at the high level, it seems like it's often trying to do too much, or it's not doing enough, or it's hard to do well. But if you can assign the teams outcomes that they're aiming for, I've seen that done well. Some teams have an outcome. You need to get 5 times as many users in the next year. We know we're a good product market fit for who we have. We just need to scale it. And you give them that kind of outcome as a goal. The team can make decisions using that heuristic and make really good decisions for that. But instead, if you micromanage and tell them, you need to do this feature, which because I'm very smart and in charge over here, I know is going to have this outcome that I want, then you're going to miss a whole lot of options that you never would have thought of that the team on the ground is going to be able to come up with. Or they're going to hit a roadblock on your brilliant idea, and they're going to work on it anyway because they were told to, even though another idea is going to get 80% of it and it's not blocked. And like delegating that kind of ownership is just so powerful. But they need the direction to be set. So what are the outcomes that they're aiming for? And if you ask people at a lot of companies on a lot of teams, they don't know what outcomes the leadership is looking for. And often if you ask the leadership, they don't know either because they're not thinking that way. Maybe the CEO has their pet project and they just want their pet project done in the end. They're not talking about outcomes.
Yeah, I guess usually it's like at the very top revenue. And then like after that, maybe things are blurry, right? And like we need something between revenue and a feature. Yeah. So it kind of like an indicator, like you said, of, if we increase number of users, ideally there's some implicit relationship or explicit relationship there to revenue, and the business is happy, the users are happy because they get value from the product.
And retaining users, that gets skipped a lot, even though that's totally in the math equations in the real world.
Yeah. And then once you get that alignment, I guess, let's say there's an example where, we don't have that type of delegation. Do you think it's reasonable that the pod, whether the EM or the PM or individual engineers, like push back? I'm like, hey, we're not going to deliver your idea? Or do you think most of the time it's just like, you kind of go with the flow?
I think it depends on the environment. If the pushback is going to go well, if you have enough support from enough people that you can push back and they'll say, whatever, then you have a really good outcome, and then you can tell that story, which of course most teams don't tell, but you could tell the story of how successful that thing was. Then you'll be celebrated for it. That's great. But if you push back and it's an environment where you're not supposed to push back, you might just be seen as a troublemaker, and you're actually pulling the team down because someone else could at least do this less effective idea slower and eventually have an impact instead of turning over and over and over and over. So it's about knowing which environment you're in and how much support you have or can get to be able to push back. And for me personally, if I'm in a team where I'm not empowered and I'm supposed to just do what I'm told forever and it's dumb and I don't agree with it, I can't work there for very long. I get really burnt out and frustrated.
Yeah, I think that's probably true for a lot of people. A little bit of a balance there of like doing, like, it's more ways of working than it is like doing the thing you think is best, is what I'm kind of hearing. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.